This naturally leads to a discussion of synthesizers. Now, this is a very brief discussion of the history of synthesizers, and it's fascinating. It really is how things have developed. So, back in 1937, the first organ was developed in Germany. The Hammond soon after developed the Nova Chord in 1939. Now, these organs are really unique because they're reed generators and they have drawbars and they're set into octaves, usually 3-4 octaves. And you pull out a drawbar, it adds more of that harmonic content. So you can decide how you want the drawbars to generate different kinds of sounds. 1935, Yamaha, electronically blown reeds. Solovox by Hammond in 1940. On one hand, you had a lead sound. On the other hand, you might have a piano kind of sound to accompany. Hohner produced one in 1940, a dual keyboard with sawtooth generators. And everybody at that point was starting to understand that if we gave you oscillators that generated sine waves or more complex square waves and sawtooth waves, you could add in harmonic content to what you were playing. So you could simulate different things. So in France, 1941, another organ development, 1947, these things were starting to be used in popular music. So people saw these as unique sounds that they could incorporate in a creative kind of way. The real development happened pretty much with the development of the transistor, because at that point they could get away from these big tube units and they could get into smaller designs that were less heat generation and much more electronics compacted into one little area. A picture that you're looking at of an electronic music synthesizer from the 50s. And things started to really start taking off with the development of the transistor. In 1960, modular synthesizer with transistor technology became the thing. And in 64, Robert Moog developed his first synthesizer. I'm sure everybody's heard of the Moog synthesizer. That's become sort of a household word for early synthesis. But in reality, there was a whole period leading up to it for 30 years, 20 years. And he was influenced very heavily. They had these conferences of modern music and avant-garde orchestration and composers. They'd get together and compose classical music for electronic instruments. That's where Robert Moog decided he was going to start delving into electronic music and developed his first synthesizer by 66, first recording using a Moog and a tape loop technology, which was Mellotron and Chamberlain. We actually owned a Mellotron at the studio that I worked at, and it was a 1966 instrument. What it was is fascinating. It was like the early idea of sampling. It was a keyboard that when you'd press a key, it would push a pinch roller against another roller that was spinning, and it would drag a piece of tape over a tape head, and you'd let go of the key, and there was a weight on the bottom of the tape, and it would drop down to the bottom of the keyboard again. So it was these huge, sort of harp-like looking sound modules, and you'd put one in. One was a string sound. Take it out, put another one in. One was a flute sound, and you could do that. And they were actual real sounds that were recorded on quarter-inch tape, and they had maybe 40 notes worth. And you'd play the keyboard just like you were playing a regular keyboard, and every time you'd hit a key, it would make that piece of tape go over this huge long tape head and play back. And you could only play it for so long, because if you hold the note down too long, you'd get to the end of the tape, and then it would stop playing the note, and then you'd have to let go, and it would drop down and start over again. A lot of the early string sounds on the Beatles recordings were Mellotron, and everybody longs for those cool old sounds. That's what it was. In 1968, Robert Moog developed the Mini Moog, which was really sort of groundbreaking. People still use the Mini Moog today. It actually had 3 oscillators, and you could simulate the first couple harmonics in a sound. So it could sound a little like a horn, a little like a string, a little like a flute. Not exactly, but it was a cool synthesizer sound. And musicians that use it were everyone from Pink Floyd, Todd Rundgren, The Who, Stevie Wonder, you name it. Everybody was into using synthesizers because it was a unique new sound that you couldn't generate any other way. Then we get into more my era, which was 1977 was the Synclavier, which was a sampler. And that was a full-on computer system. Cost $200,000 for it. And the manual stack was like 5 manuals that were 5 inches thick each. And it was impossible. But you know what? Lots of people thought this was the coolest, newest thing. This was the ultimate. And they learned how to work it and use it. And I had a friend actually who spent years developing a sound library for it just by sampling every sound known to man. He just spent his whole life creating Synclavier libraries, and unfortunately in '79 Fairlight came along with an easier sampler to use on the bottom left. Prophet 5 was in the middle. Prophet 5 is still a great, cool sounding analog synthesizer. And then, of course, the DX7, which was extremely groundbreaking when it came out. I remember I was in the studio when it first was released, and one of the keyboard players I knew was the first guy in Chicago to get one. And he brought it to the studio, and we listened to it. We plugged it in. We had to hear it. Had to hear what it was like. And he'd play this sound. It was like a train sound. He'd play this one. It was like a whistle sound. It's like we're looking at each other going, wow, this is really useful. So we eventually dumped all the sounds and reprogrammed it. That's when we got into reprogramming. But it was a really cool new technology. It was FM synthesis. We'll get into the different types of synthesis in a minute. 1987, Roland D50, very, very groundbreaking synthesizer. The M1, which I still have, 1988, was considered one of the best controllers for MIDI because it allowed you to get the full down pressure swing. A lot of these synthesizers wouldn't allow the full division of down pressure, but the M1 had 128 divisions in its keyboard, so you could really express yourself in terms of how hard you hit the keys. 1980s, analog modeling synthesizers. 2000s, digital software synthesizers. The Korg company is now developing polyphonic analog synthesizers again. So they're going back to analog synth because it was such a great sound. So in terms of synthesizers, there's a lot of different architectures that determine how the synthesizer is creating its sound. These are the main types. The thought process behind how they were going to be recorded. Additive synthesis is basically adding harmonic additions to your generators. So it's like adding more harmonic structure. So you're kind of going from the fundamental and building from there to try to get something that sounds pretty much like a real sound. Subtractive synthesis is really unique, where they give you a much more full harmonic content, and then you go ahead and filter out things you don't want. So you're left with only the things you do want. Sort of the same concept in reverse. FM synth, frequency modulated synthesis, which was a really unique thing when it came out. It's not as unique now. Physical modeling synthesis, algorithm-based DSP modeling spectrums. So basically, now you can go ahead and you can look at the spectrum of a 60-piece orchestra, a string section playing, and see what the harmonic structure is and use an algorithm to recreate that. So that's really just taking the computer and faking what the harmonic structure would be in a real orchestra. The same thing really occurs when you use a plug-in, whether it's a compressor or an EQ. It's taking what the analog EQ or compressor would be doing to the signal and modeling it in the digital domain with an algorithm, saying, okay, this is what it should look like coming in, and this is what it should look like coming out of this black box. And in between, we don't really care how it's done. It's just done with mathematical algorithms, but it brings the signal that coming in comes out the right way as an analog piece of gear would have done. Well, many times a MIDI controller was just a synthesizer, but the MIDI controller typically does not have sounds associated with it. It really was just to input the digital data. That's actually a really good question. What's the difference between a MIDI controller and a synthesizer? The MIDI controller and the synthesizer can both give you MIDI data to record into a sequencer, but generally speaking, a MIDI controller is geared primarily to give you all of the parameters in the best way possible of a performance and not a sound. So they spend their money on perfecting the electronics to get the performance data, versus a synthesizer that's really built primarily to generate a sound. Okay, and last but not least, the sampling synthesis, which is a sound sampling modification of the sound envelope to create different kinds of sounds.